They're a very worthy species to chase on the fly. They're really well designed for eating. They actually don't have stomachs, so they can't retain food for store. So they have to constantly keep eating, and that's a good thing for us as anglers. Is they have to eat, so there's a chance that we can feed them. So my name is Rick Meixel. I fish for carp a lot. I've been doing it for at least 20 years, and I'm lucky enough to be very close to the Denver South Platte. I fish and guide and teach on, and the Denver South Platte is traditional lands of the Southern Arapaho. And at one time there was Ute involvement as well, mostly Southern Arapaho, but it's essentially the reason for people to be in the Eastern Plains of Colorado. And it was long neglected, polluted, lots of trouble as urban rivers saw throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But since we've kind of come to our senses and realized that urban fisheries are important, we have taken really good care of it, and it's made an amazing rebound. And the current star of the show, although smallmouth bass, which we heard a lot about tonight, will soon become the major star of the show, the Denver South Platte, is the common carp. And for a very long time, carp were thought of as a trash fish, or they're thought of as invasive. But if you travel to Europe, they're more popular than trout. They're more popular than bass. They're a very worthy species to chase on the fly. I found a lot of really rewarding success with them in my time. They are very challenging, and they keep you coming back. And that's kind of the big reason why a lot of folks like me get really obsessed with it, is we could do it for extremely long times, decades, and still get our butt kicks every day. So it kind of keeps you coming back. So a little about the fish, found in every state in the union except for Alaska. The current IFGA all tackle record is 76 pounds. There are fish in Europe that eclipse the 100-pound mark. Those fish are in private lakes that are heavily fed. Here in Colorado, trophy fish is above 20 pounds. A year maker fish is above 30 pounds. If you put that in perspective, a trophy trout or a trophy bass is 5 pounds. A very, very small carp is 5 pounds. So they're big. They're thought of as warm water fish, but they're active in a very wide temperature range. All they need is a temperature increase to stimulate metabolism, so they can be caught year round. And we have caught them every month of the year here in Colorado. As we experience climate change and as things get warmer and trout fisheries are under stress, there is not a single day of the year that you can't go chase carp on the fly and feel ethically irresponsible for doing so. Quite frankly, the warmer it gets, the happier they get and the easier they get to catch often. My daughters and I were out fishing today. It was 100, like right on the dot, and the fish were extraordinarily happy. They're voracious omnivores, so they eat lots of different things. They're really well designed for eating. They actually don't have stomachs, so they can't retain food for store. So they have to constantly keep eating. And that's a good thing for us as anglers, is they have to eat, so there's a chance that we can feed them. They're also quite prolific. They can spawn multiple times a year. Here in Colorado this year, we've had a lot of up and down weather, hot and cold. And I've seen the carp in the Denver South Platte spawn successfully 4 times this year. So they're doing well for themselves. To kind of get off topic, or to get more on topic at that point, I'm not quite sure what the temperature of this room is, but I present for a lot of folks on the species and how to fish for them. And sometimes I get folks that have come around and realize that carp are a worthy species to catch. And sometimes I get the old rhetoric of they're invasive, throw them on the bank. Invasives, throw them on the bank, where there are carp in some fisheries, and we're talking specifically about common carp, not Asian carp or grass carp. While they are sometimes invasive in particular fisheries, they were introduced here in the States, just like trout were, just like many salmonoid species were, for food and for recreation. Here in Colorado, carp were introduced to the Denver South Platte in 1874. Brown and rainbow trout weren't introduced till the 1890s, and they were specifically introduced into the Denver South Platte as a food fish and a sport fish. So if you're going to claim that they are invasive species, they are just as invasive, actually slightly less than rainbow and brown trout. So people put them here. It's time to enjoy them. There's no reason to kill a fish unnecessarily. One of the other reasons they get such a bad name is they are exceptionally hardy. They're really good at being fish. They can tolerate very low dissolved oxygen, and they can tolerate high pollutant levels. And in the 50s and 60s, when people were dumping raw sewage and all kinds of pollutants into our waterways, trout and bass couldn't really handle it. They weren't doing so well. But carp, being so good at being fish, they bounced back and they held steady. And a lot of biologists that weren't really doing the proper research claimed that these fish were out competing or they were taking away food sources for these species. And reality is they were just better at being fish, and they stuck around while some of the trout species or bass species disappeared. Now on to what makes them really tough to catch on the fly, and the reason a lot of us really like them. Carp can actually hear. They have what's called the Weberian apparatus or Weberian organ that functions much like an eardrum. So when you're walking the banks and your boss calls you telling you have to come in early and your phone rings, they can physically hear you and they will spook. Most fish species just pick up the vibration via the lateral line. They have extraordinarily sensitive lateral line and barbel and olfactory system. And when we were kids and we had worms or corn on a hook and we caught carp very easily, it was because those carp essentially have a giant nose/mouth in the form of two barbels, one on the upper lip, one on the lower lip, a mouth lined with olfactory sensors all along the faceplate, where they could pick up the scent of that corn or those worms from hundreds of yards away. And we as fly anglers, we're using super glue and fur and chicken feathers tied to a hook. And it is equally as negative in our favor for that, because they know right away that that's not real food. So we have to be very good at our presentation, make it look like food, because their senses, their smell senses, are going to tell them right away it's not good to eat. They also have color vision. So most fish species just see in shades of gray in the spectrum. Carp can actually see color much like we as people see color. And therefore, your fly tying will be judged on the highest level. The best part about carp, though, is they're large, abundant, and they're very hard to catch with a fly. Here where I'm at right now, I could throw a rock, and the closest fish species I can catch is most definitely a common carp. And in most parts of the country, that's the case as well. So for those of us that are really busy, I work a ton. I have 3 young children. I have a lot going on in life. I can sneak out an hour before work, stay an hour late after work and catch fish and really enjoy it. So what do you need to catch carp? They're big fish and they pull hard. So you need appropriate gear. So personally, I think a 6 or a 7 weight fly rod, 9 foot's kind of the magic length, is your best bet. If you have an 8 weight, it'll work just fine. Although it's probably not as fun when they get really sporty. If you have a 5 weight, I don't want to discourage you from going out and trying it because it's really fun, but there is a chance you may break a rod. I broke a 6 weight today. You do need a large arbor reel with a good amount of backing. When you go to the fly shop and have the folks get you all set, most of the time it doesn't really matter. Trout and most bass species aren't going to take you into backing very often. I saw my backing 3 times today. They will pull hard, so you need to make sure you have an appropriate amount of backing and good knots. Wakeboard floating lines are going to be your best bet. Carp fishing is 100% sight fishing, so there's no need for a sinking line. You're never going to be blind casting for them. When we talk about presentation, you'll kind of learn why, but it's a very small feeding window. So every fish that we catch, we're seeing and we're watching eat. So floating line is always the way to go. But we did note that they can see color, so you want to keep that fly line muted. No bright orange lines, no bright green lines. They're not leader shy in any way, shape, or form, although they are bad presentation shy. We're fishing pretty heavy terminal tackle for them, 12 to 16 pound fluorocarbon leaders and tippet. Fluorocarbon is important for 2 reasons. One, it's very abrasion resistant, and most of these fish we're chasing are in very urban environments with sharp edges of rebar, big pieces of concrete, things that can cut leader. Fluorocarbon is just stronger in that way. And most of our fish are going to be eating off the bottom, off the substrate. So fluorocarbon sinks faster, and we need to get that fly down in the pocket very quickly. We noted that it's a sight fishing only game, so we need to have good quality polarized sunglasses. So we need to be able to see that fish. Copper or amber seem to be the most versatile lens colors for most light types. If you're in a lot of low light, if you're in a cloudy place like the Pacific Northwest, maybe a lighter color like a yellow or a pink. The dark blue or the dark gray lenses tend to not be very versatile, so I would probably stay away from those. You want a big landing net. Your little trout net is going to get blown out, and I say that from firsthand experience. I've blown out a lot of nets. We need big nets with big rubber bags to handle these fish safely. Of course, we need flies, but we don't need indicators, weights, any of that auxiliary stuff. It's pretty straightforward. My trout bag has 15, 16, 17 boxes, multiple stashes, a ton of tippet. My carp bag's about this big. It has 2 boxes, one for light flies, one for heavy flies, 2 spools, a tippet, and a pair of cutters, and that's really it. Knots are really important for carp. We're going to be testing these knots because they're going to pull really hard. If you're a fan of the surgeon's knot, I strongly suggest you forget it unless you're doing Euro style and tying off tag ends. It's not a very strong knot. Leader to tippet is always a blood knot. And then to the fly, we want to use a loop knot if it's a straight eye fly, or a good old fashioned clinch knot if it's jig. As was noted in the earlier presentations, the loop knot gives a lot more action. And with carp, it's all about micro action when we present. So we want to add all the action that we're going to get without stripping it to the fly. If it's a jig fly, though, and tied on an up eye hook, the loop will actually kill the action. So we'll just tie that with a good old fashioned clinch knot. So we talk about seasonality. As of this month, I guess, personally, I've caught a fly, carp on the fly every consecutive month in the state of Colorado since 2006, I want to say. I think that's when I started doing it. You can catch them in the winter, you can catch them in the spring, you can catch them in the summer. Quite frankly, whenever you have a temperature shift or it's warm enough, they'll eat. Spring, summer, and fall are continually consistent with appropriate ambient temps, of course. If it gets really hot, I fish a lot in Arizona. Sometimes shade lines can be important as they will move into the shade to kind of regulate body temp. Calm days are ideal because it is sight fishing. So we can see the fish better when there's not a lot of wind. But that said, crummy days, rain fronts approaching, socked in rain weather, high clouds, those are probably the best catching days. The fish get stimulated by frontal activity. They feed aggressively as they know the weather's changing. They're also less spooky because they can't see overhead predators, but it's way harder for you to see them. So you really need to upgrade your game. On those cloudy days, you can catch a bunch more fish. It's just a lot harder for you to catch them. Night fishing is entirely possible. I do it all the time. The only tricky part is you have to see them. So the headlamp game is a little difficult. If you shine a spotlight directly on them, they're going to spook. But if you allow them to swim naturally into the light, they definitely will eat. Quite frankly, I live in an urban area where there's lots of street lights and park lights and ambient lights from houses. All you need is a little bit of a light. Those scales will reflect them. You can see them really well at night. It's not easy to do, but it's a ton of fun. If you don't have the time, you can go after hours and get them in the dark. Winter carping is totally possible as well. Here in Colorado, we're spoiled. We have 50 and 60-degree days in January and February where that front's coming in and the wind picks up and warms everything up. And because they constantly need to be feeding, they don't have a stomach to retain food. It's just enough to stimulate their metabolism and they'll get on the feed. That picture on the bottom right is my daughter. I think this was either late February or early March. She's wearing a jacket. There's no leaves on the trees. It was cold, but it was just warm enough to get those fish stimulated and feeding. And you can catch a ton in the winter. So one thing to note that I didn't mention in an earlier slide is defense mechanisms for carp. So when they spook, they emit a stress pheromone that is a chemical trait that goes into the water and it puts down all the other fish that could pick up that chemical trait. So it's really important that when you present to a fish, you make sure you take your time, you do it right, and you pick the right fish. Because if you spook a fish, quite frankly, every other fish in that area is going to be spooked as well. And you're going to have to walk a ways to find more fish. So one of the biggest hurdles that I had to overcome when I started doing this was identifying happy fish. So we want fish that are actively feeding, fish that are going to be catchable. Because if we cast at a fish that's not actively feeding, a fish that's grumpy, they're going to emit that stress pheromone and put down all the other fish in our area, and we're going to spook them. So the easiest way to tell if a fish is actively feeding is that mouth is moving. You see that projectile mouth opening and closing. When they open their mouth, there's a distinct white line between the two sets of lips. You'll see that line appear and disappear. If that mouth is moving, that fish is in play. That's a fish that's ready to play the game. They need to be moving, but not in a defense. So if they're rocketing upstream, they're either spooked or they're trying to get somewhere, they're totally not going to eat. They're glued to the bottom of the substrate or they're floating, not moving at all on the top. those fish are regulating body temperature. They're not eating unless you see those mouths moving. Here in the summertime, we see a lot of fish that'll do that high float on tops of ponds. And those fish are just there trying to regulate body temperature, trying to get ready to go eat again. Probably not worth casting at them because they're going to spook and scare all the other fish. There's three main types of good, happy fish. Tailors are the best. Cloopers are probably the second best, and cruising fish are the third. And tailing fish are just like tailing redfish or tailing bonefish in the saltwater. They're face down, tail up, wagging in the sky. They're actively feeding. They're focused on feeding. Their eyes are monocular and they're downward facing. So they're focused on that substrate. So what's going on up here isn't super important. They still can spook. They have great movement detection at a periphery, but they're more focused on eating on the substrate. So if we're able to get a fly in their zone and they see it quickly, they're going to eat. The more skin that's out of the water, the better. So when you see them tailing, just like redfish, you'll see that tail pop up. Sometimes you'll see the whole back out. Sometimes you'll see them so shallow that just their eyeballs and mouth are underwater. The more that they're out of the water, the more aggressive they are for feeding, the more risks they've taken, and the more likely they are just to pounce on your offering because they've taken the risk to get that far. Another type of fish that we see that's happy quite often is a clooping fish. So clooping fish are ones that are up sloping in the substrate. You'll see them under cottonwoods. In the Midwest, you'll see them under mulberries. They're reaching up and they're pulling down. One thing to consider about a clooping carp is that they take air into their mouths. It goes into their swim bladder and it makes them more or less buoyant. So if you see fish around your carp pond jumping for air, they're not rising to dry flies. It's not necessarily spawning behavior, although it can be at certain times of the year. Most of the time, it's those fish opening those mouths and either taking in or releasing air so they become more or less buoyant to move up or down in the water column. So when fish are clooping on the surface, if they were to break that surface film and take in air, they would become more buoyant and it would really throw off their ability to feed at the level they want to. So most of the time when they're clooping or sucking down from the surface, they're just below the surface film. So if you think of a plane of glass, we as the angler are on the top and the fish is below. They're just below that plane, sucking down, never breaking the plane to bring it in. There are, of course, exceptions to that. In Montana and Wyoming, I've seen fish that, because the primary food source is hoppers, they're breaking the surface to eat hoppers, and it's worth that buoyancy change to get that protein. Or in the Midwest, we see with mulberries that they'll break the surface to take in mulberries. But most of the time, you want to think about having a fly that's just below the surface, so they're not going to take in air as they suck down. The last positive fish is a cruising fish, and it's one that's moving with purpose, but not with an alarm. Usually mid-water column, so it's not on the bottom, it's not cruising the top. They're normally stopping to eat. You'll see them pause, and you'll see that mouth moving, but you're always seeing the mouth moving. And the best example you see of the cruising fish are when dragonfly larvae are present in really weedy fisheries. The dragonfly larvae will scoot from weed to weed, and the fish will actually chase them down and eat the mid-column. And the mid-column eats, as a sight fishing game, are the most exciting because they're not stopping to drop on it. They're just chasing it down, and that mouth's going, and they kind of suck it in, and it's a ton of fun. A really important technique as you start chasing these fish, though, is to not cast unless you're sure it's a happy fish. If you cast at a fleeing or spook fish, they're going to spook more and release more stress hormones and put down all the fish in the area, and you have to walk way further to find more. And also not casting at stagnant fish, fish that are sunning or glued to the bottom because they're cold. Because again, they're not going to eat. They could, but most of the time they're not going to eat, and you're likely going to spook them and emit stress pheromones. So as we talk about flies, they're voracious omnivores, so they eat lots of different things. So we don't have to get focused on matching the hatch. Even if we see an abundant hatch, it's very likely that they could care less. What we're focused on is making a fly look like food, making it look like something they've eaten, and making it a quick choice presentation and making sure that they eat it quickly. So most common forage, is crayfish. Here in the Denver South Platte River, that's what they're eating most of the time. All of the crayfish patterns are tied headstand style, much like bonefish and permit flies, with feed chain or barbell eyes and an upward facing hook. So it can get down to the substrate and the hook is facing up. So when they eat it, it's hooked very quickly. The way that a carp eats is they have very gummy projectile mouths. and the bottom lip extends from the top lip. It engulfs the food that they're eating and it pulls it and sucks it back up. So we want to make sure that we have the ability to get them hooked as quick as possible. Dragonfly nymphs, like I noted, are great in middle of summer when weedy ponds and there's dragonfly nymphs available. Worms can be really good, and we're not talking our standard San Juan worms. They need to be tied with the appropriate weight with the hook riding up. So there's a number of worm patterns from Rainey's and all kinds of other fly companies where it's essentially barbell eyes, some type of red estaz or fur, and then a leather or rubber or foam tail that just stands up and wiggles. Worms tend to be most productive on heavy flows or high color days. And that's because worms, that's how worms get in. If there's a rainstorm, we see all those worms out in our yard. Those get washed into bodies of water and they become a food source for carp. So I tend to choose worms only on those days where it's post a rainstorm or it's really off color. Most of the other times I'm starting with the crayfish. As far as choosing a color or a pattern, confidence is way more important than pattern. Hook quality is way more important than pattern. Weight is by far the most important thing. We need to get it down to where that fish is feeding very quickly and be able to get them to react and eat. The longer they have to look at it or explore it or touch it, the more likely it is going to be that their olfactory senses are going to bounce back, tell them it's not real food, and they're going to refuse and spook. So we just need to focus on a weight that gets it to where they're at in the column as quick as possible. So if we're in a river with heavy current, we're going to be using very heavy flies. If we're fishing to fish that are klooping in a pond with no current at the very top, we're going to be using extraordinarily light flies just to break the surface. For those klooping fish, cottonwood seeds and mulberries are food sources that we see all over the states. The cottonwood seed game can be really frustrating because you get these huge mats of cottonwoods and the fish are feeding fairly indiscriminately and waiting for that fish to suck in your one individual cottonwood seed versus the hundreds of thousands of other cottonwood seeds can be an exercise in frustration and make you want to pull your hair out. But when they finally do suck it in, it's a ton of fun. Chironomid nymphs in the spring can be really effective. There's chironomids in most lakes and ponds and they like to eat them. Soft tackle wet flies. And then my favorite fly for kloopers is a good old fashioned McFly foam or fuzzy foam egg, because when it's dry, it has kind of that neutral buoyancy. So it just hangs right in the surface film. As it gets wetter, it starts to sink, and that could maybe trigger eat by going down. But if it starts to sink too much, all you have to do is false cast it a few times. It will dry off and it will hang in the column as well. One note for those who fish in river systems or even in lake systems on indicator nymphing, it's highly unlikely that you're going to catch a fish in the mouth using indicator nymphing. There are exceptions to this. The LA River is one place that I have seen fish because of the abundance of those small nymphs and the way that they feed key in on flies moving to them. But in most other places that I personally have fished and most folks I've talked to, prey never swims towards a predator. So it's highly unlikely that a fly is going to be moving towards a fish in current. And quite frankly, if you were ever to present to a fish and strip the fly towards them instead of away from them, they're going to spook immediately. So the math just doesn't quite work out. They're also very good at being fish, and they're not going to expend a ton of energy to consume calories unless the calorie intake is worth it. So when a trout chases a streamer, they'll chase it 15, 20 feet to smack it down. If that trout was smart enough to do the math, he would realize that he probably wasted more energy chasing that piece of meat down than he consumed eating it. Whereas carp, they're a little smarter. They're the scholars of the fish world. They're not going to move more than, in most cases, 6 to 8 inches to eat a fly. It's a very small window they're willing to move to eat a fly. So they're not going to chase down a nymph. Furthermore, here in Denver, we have an angling culture that fishes the river and they're trout centric. And they put on heavy flies and they go into a river in the winter when big fish are stacked up in small water, and you drag those heavy flies through a big pot of heavy fish and you yank, you're going to hook something and it's not likely going to be a carp in the mouth. I'm a proponent of doing things well, and sight fishing for carp is the best way to do it. It's the most effective way to do it. If you learn how to do it right, you'll catch way more fish than you ever would indicator fishing. And it's very likely you're going to foul hook a ton of fish indicator fishing, which just isn't great. Presentation is by far the most important part rather. And I have a couple slides following this with QR codes that we've made videos on. So I'll leave them up for just a minute if you want to scan them with your phone or take a screenshot and follow those QR codes. The videos can go way more into depth than I can in this quick seminar. Presentation is really tricky and it's really important. We know that they can smell really well, and our flies are made out of things that don't smell like carp food. We know that they can see really well. We know that they can hear really well. We know that they're not willing to expend energy to chase down calories. It sounds kind of like a fool's errand, but in reality, you just have to have a special set of techniques to get them to eat. And we use a technique called the drag and drop. And the drag and drop is a way to cast a heavy fly, get it very close to the fish and get them to eat. So if you imagine an 8-inch dinner plate in front of the fish's mouth, very small, that's all you can count on that fish being willing to move to eat the fly. So using high vantage points, so it's less likely for them to see you, avoiding loud colored clothing, even going so far as wearing camo. You saw Priscilla's picture of her carp stand fish. We were both fully decked out in camo. I try to wear camo every time I go fishing, just reduces the chance of them seeing me. Getting as close as possible via quiet stalking, being able to reduce casting by getting close to the fish and just gently setting it out there, or a quick pendulum cast, or getting better at casting or reducing false casting, because they will see your overhead casts, your false casts, and spook.
And
all those
emphasize on
techniques.
the stalking too, because I've walked up to fish and I come to, by the time I get down to the water, because I sometimes get sloppy or just trip myself for no reason. And by the time you get to the water to where you had seen the fish, there's just a cloud of mud.
It's so tricky, isn't it? I mean, you have the fish is feeding and it's moving, and you spot them from a high vantage point, and you have to get down quickly and take the shot before the fish moves off. But at the same time, you can't be noisy or have them see your shadow or throw motion, or they're going to spook. So you're always trying to find that balance, and it takes practice of being quick but quiet and deliberate. And that's where you get to be a really good carp angler, is by it's way more about
Stealth.
being a ninja than it is being a good caster. Although casting helps too. Mm-hmm. But for the cast, we use a technique called drag and drop casting. And there's going to be a video on one of the next slides that you should watch. I'm not going to dig super deep into it because it takes a lot of practice, but we're taking advantage of the fish's kind of blind spots. We know that their eyes are monocular and they're downward facing, and they tend to be a lot girthier in the back than they do in the front. So they have this blind spot kind of towards their tail. They also have poor movement detection 3 to 4 to 5 feet outside of their periphery. So if we make that cast 4 to 5 feet outside the fish in that zone, pick the fly up and drag it across the surface film. And dragging across the top of the surface film is really important, because if you think about a fish's daily life, all kinds of stuff is going on above the surface. There's geese flying by, and there's leaves moving, and there's wind blowing. They're used to seeing motion up there, but they're never used to seeing a crayfish barreling at their eye line. If you were a crayfish and something 10 times your size that was going to eat you was nearby, you would be in the opposite direction as fast as possible. So you cast past the fish, you pick your fly up and you drag it across the surface film. And then right when you're just above the fish in that dinner plate, you release your tension. The fly slowly and gently drops down, or if you're in a river, it's quickly, but it's still smooth and delicate, hits that substrate. And in most cases, at that time, the fish sees it and either eats or spooks right then and there. It's not often you have to do more in the presentation. If you get it close to their face, it's usually an immediate eat or spook. But if they don't eat it right away, subtle fleeing action is really important to remember. So if you're a crayfish and you're about to get eaten by something 15 times your size, what are you going to do? You're going to pop up on defense first, and then you're going to slowly back away. First of all, prey is never going to rocket out of there if they're not being actively pursued. And second of all, a carp isn't going to actively pursue them. They're not going to waste those calories. So we're almost never stripping. Most of the time, it's either using the innate movement of the fly. So we talked about fly materials that move on their own, rubber legs, foam tails, marabou that just undulates in the film. Sometimes that's just enough movement to trigger them to come over and eat. If not, just short, quick rod tip twitches to just kind of move it away from the fish. We're always moving away in kind of that cat and mouse style presentation. If the fish moves a little closer, you move the fly just a little bit further away until they get to that apex where they have to choose, like, I'm going to expend too much energy to chase this fish down. I'm just either going to kill it now or I'm going to give up. And at that time, you usually get to eat or it scoops off and you're done. But always remember, prey never swims toward a predator. When I teach carp schools and teach carp anglers, the absolute worst thing you can do is spend all that time getting into the zone without scooping the fish and then twitch that fly back towards the fish because they're just going to scoop immediately. You don't want to do all that work if you did everything else right. If the fish
we got a question come through now that we're talking about like different techniques. Would you use a different technique when you're fishing from a boat for carp?
No, not at all. It's very much the same. Fishing from a boat for carp is awesome because the boat is a moving high vantage point. So I've done it from friends' flat skiffs. I have a little John boat that I rigged my Yeti to turn into a poling platform and a casting platform. And if you treat it like a flat skiff, I mean, that's what it was designed to do, stealth approach and stealth presentation. And even if you have a raft or a drift boat, you can still be pretty sneaky with the oars and feather up to them. So getting as close as possible without spooking them, trying to get it in front of the fish with as few false casts as possible. The more casting, the more chances for spooking, and trying to get it in that 8-inch dinner plate as quick as possible. The boat gives you a huge advantage. Once you get in the water, if you're waiting, you're likely going to spook fish. They're picking up on that motion. I see folks in the Denver South Platte when I'm personal fishing all the time, and they're wading through the middle of the river, and they've already essentially spooked all the fish that they could cast to. When we approach the fish on the river, we're walking very high on the bank, and we're not even dropping down until we see a target. And if you're walking lakes and ponds using cattails or trees or stuff to hide behind on the edges, it's going to give you that stealth advantage. So if anyone wants to take a screenshot here, or if you want to maybe share these after Priscilla, this is the drag and drop video. And this goes into that technique at length. And this is probably the biggest thing you have to learn to become a successful carp angler. Because if you just go cast right on their nose, they're going to spook every time. And if you go cast way far away and wait for them to show up, you're likely going to be waiting all day. So really important technique there. And then for those who fish in river systems, this is a reading water video on the Denver South Platte, but it does equate to a lot of other moving water systems on where to find them, how to find them, how to approach them, how to present them, and how to get them to eat. So the eat also is tricky, and I think you're kind of getting the pattern with carp that every little nuance is tricky with them, and that's what makes them kind of fun to catch. You don't feel the eat. You don't feel a pull back. Your line doesn't go tight. You don't have a grab. They have that projectile mouth that's lined with olfactory sensors. So when they drop their lips hit the fly and they immediately know it's not real food and they retract and they scoop. So you need to see that eat. You need to see the white of their mouth drop over your fly. And as soon as you see the white of their mouth drop over the fly, you need to hammer that hook home. Hook sets are kind of determined by a location. When I first started doing videos for carp, everyone treated them like bonefish. And they said, oh, you have to strip set them. You have to strip set them. And if you are less than a rod's length away from the carp and you want to strip set and you only have your leader out, the time it takes you to drop your fly rod, come tight with the line and strip set, the fish has already spit the fly out twice. So if you're less than about 4 or 5 feet of fly line out, just hammer them with the trout set. Just lift that hook and hit them. That's the most effective transfer of energy. If they eat more than about 5-6 feet of fly line out of the tip, then strip sets are better. I mean, you're effectively transferring that energy at an even angle. And if they miss it or they don't see it, you're only moving the fly as far as you've stripped. So there's a chance that you could get them again. They could chase down a little bit and eat it again. If you were to trout set at 20 feet, that whole length of your line coming off the water and your fly rod is how far that fly is moving. So once you miss the eat, that fish is done. There's no chance. So hook, trout set under 4 or 5 feet of fly line out of the tip, strip set everything else. It is entirely possible for you to catch fish in murky water if you can't see the mouth. You do have to be able to see the fish, specifically the tail, but you can totally tell by the body language if they ate. If you see a fish and you're just watching that tail flutter and you drop your fly in there, the fish moves to it, stops, comes level, and the tail wiggles in an S bend, set the hook. 9 times out of 10, that fish is eaten. The other one time they missed it, you almost never foul hook them in that scenario. It's a really distinct motion. On that second video, there is a section where you can see that tail reaction when the fish eats. Once you see it a couple times, it takes some practice, but you'll be able to know every single time. It's a very distinct S-bend flutter of the tail. As long as you can see the tail, you can totally get them to eat. Line maintenance is critical. This fish is going to likely take you into backing. And if your line is wrapped around your toe because you're wearing flip-flops, or it's wrapped around a piece of bridge piling, or it's wrapped around a tree, that fish is going to run. And I don't care how heavy of a tackle or how good your knots are, it's going to eventually break sometime. You're going to break the hook. So the good thing about carp is they have very gummy mouths. And in most other angling ethics portions of people's slides, you'll hear them say to pinch your barbs or smash your barbs or use barbless hooks. In carp fishing, you absolutely want to use barbed hooks 100% of the time. There's no hard bone in that mouth to retain a hook. So if you don't have a barb to hold it in that gum, it's the second they change directions, it's going to slip out. There's absolutely no damage you can do to that fish by using a barbed hook. It comes out very easily out of that specific skin type. We do, like those of us that European style fish as well. In Europe, carp are treated with amazing reverence, and they're put on pedestals, and they're worth thousands of dollars to be caught again. So we carry around a little disinfectant. So when I release a fish, I'll put a little dab of disinfectant in where I took the hook out, and I'll put a little dab of disinfectant on any other open wounds I've seen. It's just something that I've picked up from the European culture that I think is really cool. The other good news about that is you don't need to baby the fight. We're using heavy terminal tackle, 12, 16 pound tippet. We're using very heavy, good quality fly rods and reels. We've practiced our knots. We know our knots are good. If you hook that fish in the mouth, unless it wraps you around some terminal piece of infrastructure, a bridge piling, a shopping cart, a tree, and you're using good quality hooks, of course, there is zero way you're going to lose that fish. They never spit the hook. They never roll. They never break off. If you're fighting it properly and you're using good equipment, they're going to stay on and you're going to land every single fish. It is important that you fight them properly, though. You use low rod angles. We're never lifting our arm up and throwing it to the sky like we saw on a river runs through it. We're low and deep. We're dropping that tip. We're pointing the tip at the fish, and we're bending. So we're fighting just with the butt section, just with the bottom two sections of the rod. If we just were to fight with the tip section, we could at max put 6-7 pounds of pressure on the fish. In the butt section, we can get somewhere up to the 10, 12, 13 pounds of pressure with a rod. We're never stressing our terminal tackle. We want to minimize that fight. We want to get the fish landed quickly. We want to save our arm. We want to save their swim bladder and get them back and swimming happy quickly. Couple other notes on the safe handling of fish. You need a large bag to not damage the fins. They have a very strong, robust pectoral fin that links to softer pectoral fin ridges. And if you're using a net that's too small, that fin is going to blow through the side of the net bag, and it's going to slice right down that pectoral fin. While it will heal, they'll be just fine, probably. I don't want to put a giant cut in a functional part of a fish's body. So I'm using a very large net bag to make sure that fish, when he flops around or she flops around, is handled safely and isn't going to bash on anything. They will also flex when you first pick them up for your photo, and that's when you'll drop them on rocks and things and potentially injure them. So when you're going for your photo of the fish, make sure that you're prepared for that flex, but hold them over the water. Don't hold them over sharp, hard things. There's nothing that can stop getting hit in the head. It's never good for anything. Everyone's time. I thank you for having me. If you are ever in Colorado and want to talk about carp, I work a very boring job where I do spreadsheets all day. So please call me and ask me carp questions so I don't have to do them. I also teach monthly carp schools and do guided trips on the Denver South Platte for carp with my good friend Barry Reynolds, who essentially invented carp on the fly. Priscilla got to fish with him last year in Carp Slam. He's kind of my guru, and I enjoy spending time with him. So there's some books here noted as well. Barry's guide, Carp on the Fly, a fly fishing guide, is kind of the definitive volume. So definitely pick that up. But I like talking about this stuff, so feel free to give me a call as well.